Hey everyone, doing another weekly video here, and I've been doing a series of videos on the topic of marriage. Something that I guess I'm not really qualified to talk about, as I've never been married, but um, just been looking at the scriptures, and I think we're all qualified to do that, regardless of our state. We can look at the scriptures and see what God has to say about the topic. So I may not have experiential knowledge. I do have the scriptures, and so what I've been doing is just pointing out what I see in those scriptures in regards to marriage and divorce. And so in the first video, we just went through and I listed the different verses that I saw throughout the Bible on marriage, and then just kind of commented on those. And then last week, kind of went through and defined what marriage is and how marriage takes place. And so then this week, the final one here, we're going to look at the issue of divorce and remarriage, which unfortunately is pretty common in today's culture. Um, I think like 50% of all marriages end in divorce, and most people don't have the gift of singleness and they remarry. Well, what does the Bible say about that topic? Is that lawful to do? Are they committing adultery? So I think we're going to look at three specific spots in the scriptures where divorce is addressed, and just kind of see what the Bible has to say about the topic. And then it's our job to submit ourselves to that. Um, as always, if you can't watch this live, subscribe to my YouTube channel and you can watch this or any of my videos at your convenience. It's King Ram 417. That's K, my middle initial, Ingram, my last name, 417. And I usually get these posted as soon as I'm done going live. This one here will be a little bit quicker. It's just a real short article. I wrote that at the beginning of this year, January 30th, 2019. And so we should be able to get through this pretty quick. As always, I want to start with prayer, so if you want to pray with me. Lord, I thank you just how gracious you are at the work you do in our hearts, and how your Holy Spirit is always ministering to us, always convicting and correcting and guiding and shepherding us into obedience, Lord, and trying to lead us into obedient paths. And so prior to going into this, I felt your conviction that I would try not to come into this with an intent to prove a point, but that instead I would simply look at your word and expound what I see there. There's a fine line between just looking at what you've said and expounding it, just exegeting it, just looking at it without preconceived ideas, versus coming in with opinions and things that we want to be true or not be true, and then trying to use the scriptures to justify our position. And so I never want to be in that second camp, Lord, although I know I probably am. We're fallible and fallen. We got sinful minds and prideful hearts, and we always want to be right. And so, Lord, I just pray for your guidance. I pray that you said teachers would have the greater condemnation, Lord, and so please put me in fear and reverence before your word, that I would be diligent to not bring in my opinions, and where I am wrong, Lord, I pray that you would stop people's ears, that you would hinder them from hearing what I say, that it would just go in one ear and out the other, and that whatever's true, Lord, whatever's good and glorious, that it would edify your saints, that it would be used, Lord, to bring them into closer fellowship with you, and a deeper level of obedience, Lord, and myself as well, Lord. So often I'm edified by reading through these, and It stirs up my zeal and my passion and gets me excited for your word, Lord. And so I thank you for that, and I just ask that whatever's true, that it just sticks in our hearts, Lord, and whatever's false falls away. And that if I'm wrong in any area, Lord, that you send someone with wisdom, Lord. Often people try to bring correction with opinions, Lord. They come with unscriptural opinions. They come with logic or reasoning or tradition or just clever arguments, Lord, but they don't have the word, Lord. So I pray, if I'm going to be corrected, Lord, if I'm wrong on something, it's got to be done by your word. I have to see it in your word. And so I pray that if I am wrong on anything, Lord, in any of my videos, that you would send someone with wisdom and with your word to correct me. Be with me as I go through this video, and humble me and glorify your name, Lord. I love you, Lord. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. All right, so again, this one's called Divorce and Remarriage. So the main verse I want to look at where Jesus talks about this specifically is from Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 9. And the Pharisees also came unto him, tempting him, and saying unto him, Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? And we talked about last time that phrase "put away" is what is meant by divorce. Verse 4, And he answered and said unto them, Have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? And said, For this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. They say unto him, Why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement, and to put her away? He saith unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say unto you, Whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whoso marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery. So here in these verses, Jesus specifically defines when God permits divorce and when he doesn't. He states that merely issuing a divorce certificate, because that's what Moses had done. Moses, as the representative of government at that time, allowed the Jews to write a divorce certificate. But Jesus nullifies that. He states that, merely issuing a divorce certificate does nothing to separate the marriage union. Why? Because it's not man that puts marriage together. It's not a certificate that makes a marriage, so it's not a certificate that can take a marriage apart. It's man has no say in it, therefore man cannot disannul it. Marriage is a supernatural union that God institutes, in which a man and a woman cleave together through sexual union and make a covenant before God, that they are to be with each other, and it's that one and only, and it's permanent. God has done that on a spiritual, supernatural level. There's been an actual bond made between those two. It can't be broke. You can't just write a certificate and undo something supernatural that God has done. Only God can separate that. And Jesus points out that he does not allow for that. And anyone who presumes to do so commits adultery by being with another person. And that's a severe crime. The scriptures tell us that no adulterer will enter heaven. And that I can't remember if it's 1 Corinthians 6 or Revelation 21, but either way, adultery is one of the things that will keep you out of heaven and be cast into the lake of fire. All sin for that matter, but adultery is a sin. However, Jesus does allow divorce and remarriage for one instance, for one particular situation. In verse 9, he says, except it be for fornication. Now, there's various opinions on what this could mean, but I think, and I think the confusion comes from the distinction between words like fornication, adultery, sexual immorality. What is meant by fornication there? And I haven't studied it out, but in a general sense, fornication is sex without the covenant of marriage. So when he says except it be for fornication, I'm taking that to mean, and study this out for yourself, because there is a view within the Christian church called the permanence view, in which they say there is no clause for divorce, that there's no allowance here for divorce. That's not what Jesus means when he says except it be for fornication. And they very well could be right. I take this at face value. When I read it through, it just logically makes sense to me. The fact that Jesus said except means that there's a clause. He says divorce is not permitted except it be for fornication. And fornication, again, is sex outside of a marriage covenant. So anyone who divorces and remarries for any other reason is committing adultery. Some people might say, well, what about an abuse situation? You may, I think, for safety reasons, want to separate from your husband, but you're not permitted to remarry. You're not permitted to have any other relations. You could pray that God either redeems your husband or wife, whoever the abusing spouse is, because I think if somebody's beating you, that's a sign that they're not born again, that they're not right with God. For how shall a child of God do something as wicked as that? And the fact that you are born again, God will fight your battles for you. And that's a terrifying thing for your spouse, because he's coming against the daughter or the son of a king. And the Lord will take vengeance. So I would say that you can separate and pray that they're either redeemed or that God smites them. And if God kills them, then you're permitted to remarry. And if there's true sorrowful repentance and fruit of the Spirit, that they've been born again, that there's true grief over their behaviors, their previous behaviors, then there can be this great reconciliation. And that's a really hard thing, and it's a tragic thing, and it's heartbreaking to hear of anybody in that situation. And that's part of why we court, before marriage. You want to really get to know a person, to ensure you know who it is that you're taking this permanent bond of marriage with. But once you're married, Jesus makes it clear that except for fornication, there is no remarriage. You can't divorce and remarry, otherwise you're committing adultery, because that spiritual bond still remains, regardless of the government certificate that you've received, regardless of the declaration you've made that you're no longer going to be with this person. That spiritual bond remains. God has not separated that. And so if you then go and sleep with somebody else, you're committing adultery. You're bringing that bond into a different relationship. But if your spouse commits the sin of fornication, which again, I'm reading that as sex outside the covenant of marriage, cheating, he then does mercifully allow for a divorce, and you would not be guilty of committing adultery for remarrying. God allows this grace due to the unfaithful spouse. If they cheat on you, he permits a divorce and remarriage. However, there ought to be a striving for reconciliation, especially if the person is truly and genuinely first of all, it's incredibly grievous, and there's no degrees of sin. Sin is sin in God's eyes, but to me personally, cheating on your spouse is the most grievous offense. It just stirs up rage in my heart, because somebody has committed to you permanently. They've essentially given you their heart, their emotions. They've said, here, I am yours, permanently. And that's scary because you're trusting yourself to somebody else. You're being completely vulnerable and giving your heart to somebody else and saying, I'm yours, do with me what you will, and then expecting them to be merciful and loving and gracious and kind. And by cheating, they're just basically stabbing you in the heart. They're just ripping you apart. And it's so wicked and so evil, and there's no need for it. There's no it's the lust of the eyes or the lust of the flesh or whatever it is that's pulling somebody away from their marriage. It's so vile and wicked, and shouldn't be done. With that said, if a saint does commit adultery and cheat on their spouse, thinking about the married couples I know, if that happened to somebody I know, I would be filled with rage against the person that did it. But if they genuinely repent, and there's true sorrow, and like a tearing of the clothes, like, the Old Testament, they would rip their clothes to show how sorrowful they were, a rending of the heart. If you sense that in that individual, that they're truly sorry, that somehow they were deceived and fell into this wicked sin, but they're truly sorrowful. If the offended party can find it in their heart to forgive them and to work reconciliation, that should certainly be done. But if that trust has been broken, and they're unable to find it within them to reconcile, there's just that heartbreak that can't be undone. God does allow for a divorce in that situation. And it's heartbreaking because God hates divorce. So it's something you would have to just wrestle through and pray through. Divorce should be the absolute last option. And the only time it's even an option is in this case of fornication, in the case of cheating. There's no other time where it's permitted. That is never, ever the answer. No matter what kind of fights you're going through, no matter if you've fallen out of love is a choice. Choose to love again. It's there is no excuse. You can't divorce. You've made an oath. You've made a bond, a covenant in front of God. So the next section of scriptures I want to look at is 1 Corinthians 7:10 through 15. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. But and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. And let not the husband put away his wife. So that's what I was talking about before. In extreme situations like abuse, or I can't think of anything else, but where there's just something that's dangerous for you to be around, you can depart, it says here, but you have to remain unmarried, or reconciled to your husband, and vice versa. And again, then it would be a prayerful situation. If that person is not saved, you're praying for their salvation, or that God would remove them, which is terrifying, because God will defend his saints. God is vengeance belongeth to God, and surely he will do justly. So it would be difficult, but you would have to go into a time of prayer then. You wouldn't seek out remarriage, because you're still bound to that person. You can't just undo that. It's a supernatural bond. Verse 12, but to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which hath an husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. So here we find further clarification of marriage and divorce. Again, it's reiterated that divorce is not allowed. If the spouse leaves, they must remain unmarried. To do otherwise would be to commit adultery because of that spiritual bond. The thing is, we've taken marriage way too lightly. And you see that when people were freaking out a few years back about in America here, the courts allowing gays to get married. And to me, it was a nonsensical issue. Let the governments issue marriage certificates for them. That's not real marriage. That has no meaning. It's just a piece of paper issued by the government. Real marriage is the covenantal bond, the supernatural bond made between God. It's a supernatural act. We need to start seeing marriage in a different light. It's not a ceremonial, traditional, government authorized thing. It is a supernatural act of God that is permanent. It is a spiritual bonding between one man and one woman for life. And any sex outside of that, prior to that or after that, is sin outside of that bond of marriage. You are meant for one person and one person only forever, because we're two halves of a whole, and we're united together. You can't now add a third piece to a two-part puzzle. And you can't undo a permanent bonding. It is a spiritual bond that can't be undone. And this has nothing to do with government. So government can issue all the papers they want. They can do all the, and ceremonially and traditionally, you can do whatever you want. You're not undoing a supernatural spiritual bond. So if you do leave your spouse, you're not undoing that bond. That bond remains. And if then you go and sleep with somebody else, you're committing adultery. You are sinning against the oath. You are sinning against the gift that God has given you. However, we learn in these verses here that if your spouse is an unbeliever, which we learn in other scriptures that you should not marry unbelievers. What part hath Christ with Belial? We're two different kingdoms. We're not supposed to have anything to do with the unfruitful works of darkness, let alone bond with them. However, if you're already married and you get saved and your spouse remains unsaved, you're already in that bond, so now you're locked in. And that's what the scriptures are talking about. So if your spouse is an unbeliever and they choose to leave you, and I think it's implied here, though not specifically said, it's going to be because of your faith. They can't tolerate your newfound faith. But in any case, if they choose to leave you, the reason isn't specified there. I was just adding that about I would think that would be the most common case. Or let me stop giving reasons there, because no reason is mentioned here in the scriptures. It just says if your spouse is an unbeliever and they choose to leave you, you are then, as a saint of God, you are now free from that marriage and you're allowed to remarry. It states that a brother or sister is not under bondage. So what bondage are they no longer under? The bondage of the law of marriage. What God has put together, let no man tear asunder. That bond that has been made, if they choose to leave, that bond no longer remains. You are free. You're not under bondage. When we marry, we're bound to a person for life. We are united in that beautiful bondage. But God grants peace to the believer, to his child, if their unbelieving spouse departs. They are now free from that bondage. God has granted them a beautiful mercy and grace. Because otherwise, and you can see the grace in that, what would they do? If let's say you're 20 years old and your unbelieving spouse leaves you and gets the government certificate of divorce and remarries somebody else, now what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to burn with lust and desire to have a spouse for the rest of your life? In the prime of your marriage years, you're only 20 years old. Are you supposed to live like that with no spouse? There's grace. God offers grace and mercy and permits you to remarry only in the Lord, another scripture says. So you now must marry somebody who's born again, find a believer. But that's just a great grace that God offers. And then the final verse I want to look at here is Romans 7. verses 2 through 3. For the woman which hath an husband is bound by the law to her husband so long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. So then, if while her husband liveth she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. So here we see that very freedom that was being talked about in the previous verses in 1 Corinthians 7. We see the freedom from bondage that those verses refer to. A married person, again, is bound by that supernatural law of God, that covenant that's been made to their spouse, unless that spouse dies. And when they die, they are freed from that bondage. The person has died, they are now free. Once that freedom is offered, the spouse is able to remarry without condemnation or guilt. And what we see in 1 Corinthians 7 with the unbelieving spouse who leaves is the same principle. You are now free to remarry. So the bottom line then is that God does not permit divorce except in two occasions. One, if your spouse cheats on you and reconciliation can't be made. And then two, if your unbelieving spouse leaves you, abandons you, and departs from you. In both these cases, God allows a merciful grace and frees us from that covenant and oath, and frees us from that bondage. We had been permanently unified forever for life with our spouse, but because of their sins and the inability on our part to resolve it, God allows us to divorce and remarry. That's mercy. It's a merciful act of God. But other than these two instances, divorce is never permissible, other than those two plus the death of a spouse. And so that's what I got for this article. And so I just to summarize the three articles as a whole, what we find is that marriage is a supernatural union. The way we are supposed to live in righteousness and holiness is that we are supposed to stay pure and holy without sexual fornication until God brings us a spouse. And a godly spouse is a gift from God. So we wait for that godly spouse so that we're not unified and put under a yoke with an unbeliever. We wait for God to bring us a believer, and then we court so that we can examine each other's lives to make sure there's fruit and evidence of them being born again. And then once that's done, you take a vow before God. You make a permanent covenant vow to be with that one individual for the rest of your life. And once that vow is made, you consummate the marriage with sexual union, in which there's a miraculous bonding occurrence. There's a supernatural spiritual bond that is made, in which you are permanently unified to that person and you become one flesh. And because this is a supernatural, miraculous spiritual bond, there is nothing that can be done to take it apart. You are that person's, and that person's is yours for life. It cannot be done. And the only time that God allows this to be undone is if there's the death of one or the other, and then you can remarry, rebond with somebody else, or you were already married when you got saved and you have an unbelieving spouse and they decide to abandon you and marry somebody else. You are now free. You are free to remarry. Or if your spouse cheats on you, and you there can't be reconciliation made. Like, let's say they cheat on you and they decide they're going to go get that government divorce certificate and remarry. What's a saint to do? God offers grace. You are now free to remarry. But other than that, there are no grounds for divorce. So if you are married, you are permanently bound to that person. And if you're not married, you need to seriously consider what sex and marriage is, what that covenant is, and to take it very, very seriously. You are not to be having sex outside of that covenant of marriage, and once you take that covenant of marriage, it is permanent. And so we need to carefully consider who it is that we're going to marry, and we need to examine each other's lives. And then once you commit, understand the permanence of that, understand the seriousness of that. God hates divorce, the scriptures say. So that's what I got. We're moving on to a different topic next week. So Lord willing, I will see you then. As always, if you couldn't watch this whole thing, you're just catching it at the end here. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can watch this and all my videos at your convenience. It's King Ram 417. That's K, my middle initial, Ingram, my last name, 417. And I should have this one here posted shortly. All right, I love you guys. Talk to you later.